Hi everyone, and thanks for joining me. What we're going to do today is look at the 10% myth of the brain. So I'll talk a little bit about what is this myth, what does it mean, what are the origins of the myth, along with some of the things that are continuing to perpetuate it in our culture, and then finally we'll look at some pieces of evidence that can point to the fact that this really is just a myth and isn't something that's true. And of course, along the way, we'll look at a few pop culture references. We'll see a short excerpt from the movie Lucy, looking at the 10% myth there, and then also the movie Limitless from a couple of years ago that explores a very similar idea. So thanks for joining me today on Psyched with Setmire, and let's talk about the 10% myth of the brain. So what is the 10% myth? The 10% myth is the idea that we simply just use 10% of our brain or have access to 10% of our brain's power. And I'm sure you've heard either in a movie or in the media or maybe from someone you know, something similar to the idea of, you're only using 10% of your brain. Just imagine what you could accomplish if you had access to the other 90%. Well, really, really nice idea. But again, what we'll look at in this little presentation is that this really is just that, just a myth. But what are some of the origins of the myth? What are some of the things that are kind of starting this or maybe even perpetuating it? If we look at some of these origins, we can trace a lot of evidence back to a misunderstanding or maybe even just a misinterpretation of the neurological research of psychologist and philosopher William James, who said in a book that he wrote called The Energies of Men back in 1908 that we're only making use of a small part of our mental resources. I think that was kind of taken a little bit out of context to maybe be interpreted that we're only using a small part of our brain. We can trace a lot of the origins of this myth back to him and those misinterpretations. We also see that this myth is perpetuated through urban legends, kind of folklore or stories that are distributed through social media or in news stories or just between people, right? Kind of the perpetuation of this idea through storytelling. Motivational speakers have historically also really used this myth to push us to live up to our potential, and of course to make money by selling products as well and different services. And then we see Hollywood and the media playing a very large role in kind of perpetuating this myth through movies like Lucy and Limitless and Heroes and several kind of older ones that we can explore as well. So if we look at the movies and the role of pop culture a little bit in more detail, again, movies like Limitless, the show Heroes, there's a really old movie called Flight of the Navigator, and then also the movie Lucy, which just recently came out. All of these movies are really highlighting this 10% myth. So what I'd like to do is show you a brief excerpt from the movie Lucy, or at least from the trailer, kind of highlighting the 10% myth in that movie, and then also a brief excerpt from the trailer of Limitless, which takes a slightly different approach, talks about the 20% of the brain, but same idea. So let's watch a little excerpt so you can get a feel for how these movies are really highlighting this myth.
It is estimated most human beings only use 10% of the brain's capacity. Imagine if we could access 100%. Interesting things begin to happen. Yes?
Professor Norman, my name's Lucy. I just read all your research on the human brain. It's a little rudimentary, but you're on the right track.
Thank you.
I have access to 28% of my cerebral capacity. I can feel every living thing.
Since when did you start writing Chinese?
Since an hour ago.
What happens when she reaches 100%? I have no idea. All this knowledge, you can unlock secrets that go beyond our universe. I'm not even sure that mankind is ready for it.
It's like all things that make me human are fading away.
See that guy? That's me. My excuse for looking like this? I'm a writer.
Eddie, maybe it's time to let the writing go.
But just in case you think nothing ever happened to me.
Eddie Mora!
Hey! Tell me about this book.
Well, how much have you written of it?
Not one word.
Well, I suppose I can help you with that. You know how they say that we can only access 20% of our brain? This lets you access all of it. They've had clinical trials and it's FDA approved.
All right, just out of curiosity, and that's all. I was blind, but now I see. A tablet a day, and I was limitless. I now had cultural appetites.
Since when do you speak Italian?
I finished my book in 4 days.
I'd like to renegotiate my advance.
Math became useful.
From 12,000 to 2.3 million in 10 days.
I'm baffled by this guy. So, Eddie Mora, you do know you're a freak. What's your secret?
Medication.
Your powers are a gift from God or whoever the hell wrote your life script. I'll open up a line of credit for you. You'll be wanting a few toys.
How many of us ever know what it is to become the perfect version of ourselves?
What's the asking price?
12.5.
I'll take it.
Everything I have, I want to share with you.
What you doing, hon? You think somebody's watching?
My brain is skipping time. I have no memory of the last 4 days.
I'm living in that 21st century, doing something mean to it.
Your powers are not earned. You're careless with those powers. Have you asked yourself what you're going to do when you run out? You'll die.
No one man should have all that power. The clock's ticking, I just count the hours.
There's no scenario in which you'd lead this life where you don't work for me.
No scenario. I see every scenario. I see 50 scenarios. That's what it does, Carl. It puts me 50 moves ahead of you. Worth the risk? What would you do?
So as entertaining as those movies are, and as wonderful as the idea is that we could potentially untap 90% of our brain, there are quite a few reasons that we know of that indicate that this 10% myth is false. So let's look at those a little bit, just so that we can kind of debunk this myth. One of the very commonly used pieces of evidence is that brain scans really show that all regions of the brain are active during the tasks that we perform. Even during fairly routine tasks, such as having a conversation with someone, walking, listening to music, what we see is that almost all the regions of the brain are active. So there aren't any areas of the brain that are just dark and consistently not being used, even in very small tasks. Another really common piece of evidence is the idea that why would we have such large brains if we were only using a small, kind of tiny portion of them? It wouldn't be energy efficient. The brain uses approximately 20% of the body's energy. It would make very little evolutionary sense to have such a large portion of our energy really being utilized by such a, small amounts of the brain. We also see that in cases of brain damage from accidents wouldn't occur, right, as parts of the brain, if parts of the brain weren't used or needed. And what we see is there isn't really a part of the brain that can be damaged and not have some sort of consequence. And we see even in incidents of a stroke or a very small cerebral incident that we do still see consequences to that. So brain damage wouldn't occur if parts of the brain weren't used or needed. We also see that brain mapping hasn't found an area of the brain that doesn't serve a function. Right, with all of our very highly advanced techniques that we have now and methods of scanning and studying the brain, we haven't found an area of the brain that just doesn't serve any kind of purpose. Now, there's still a lot that we don't know, but from what we do know, it appears that everything is being used in some capacity. So what we really can conclude, and what scientists and researchers have concluded over and over again, is that we truly do use 100% of our brain to accomplish tasks. We just might use it in different ways at different times. In review, just to kind of wrap up this topic, as we talked about today, despite the widespread belief of the 10% myth, it really is just that. right? Simply a myth, something that we've shown over and over again to not be true, despite its popularity and widespread belief. The myth has been perpetuated by the media, misinterpretations of research, and by those who stand to make a profit from this claim, again, such as motivational speakers and so on. And we have shown right on the last slide that research is really repeatedly demonstrating that we do in fact use 100% of our brain. Again, in different ways and at different times, but that there aren't any areas of our brain that are dark or unused or not vulnerable to damage. So thank you for joining me today. I hope you found this interesting and that you learned something. And what we'll do next time is we'll look at sleepwalking through the movie Step Brothers. So thanks for joining me on Psyched with Setmire. Hope to see you again in the future.